The ducks would not leave the hole. Ruth Calloway had counted them twice that morning, the way she counted everything now, out of habit more than hope. And each time she came up with the same 6, paddling in slow, tight circles around a place in the floodwater where the current pulled down instead of across. The white duck dipped her head under and came up shaking water from her bill, and instead of drifting off toward the fence line where the grass still showed above the flood, she circled back and did it again. The others followed her round and round, like they were guarding something, or waiting for something, or listening to something under the brown water that Ruth couldn't hear. Cold seeped through her boots as she crouched at the edge of the water. She would not have believed, kneeling there in mud that smelled of rock and river stone, that in 4 months' time men would ride out from 3 counties to see what her ducks had found, or that Jonas Pruitt, who owned the biggest orchard in the valley and had laughed loud enough for the whole auction yard to hear it, would come back with his hat in his hands asking to buy the land she'd bought for $15 and a promise. But that was later. This was the beginning, and the beginning was cold and muddy and full of doubt. 3 months earlier, Ruth had stood at the back of the auction crowd in her husband's old coat, the sleeves rolled twice at the wrist, watching men she'd known her whole life bid on land that had once belonged to people who were dead or gone or too broke to keep it. Her husband Daniel had been dead 8 months, thrown from a green horse he'd been breaking for a neighbor who couldn't afford to lose a season's wages. And in that time, Ruth had learned exactly how little a widow was worth in the eyes of a county that measured a person's standing by the size of their barn. She had no barn. She had a rented room above the mercantile, a trunk of Daniel's tools she couldn't bring herself to sell, and a memory of her father's voice that came to her at strange hours, usually when her hands were busiest and her mind had nowhere else to go. Her father had not owned land either. He had spent 30 years digging other men's ditches, laying stone under other men's orchards, coaxing water down from springs that other men claimed as their own, and he had never once complained about it in front of her, though she'd heard him some nights through the thin wall of their cabin, talking low to her mother about the unfairness of building a thing you'd never get to keep. What he'd given Ruth instead of land was knowledge, the kind that didn't show up on any deed. He'd taught her to read the lay of ground the way other men read a newspaper, to know by the color of grass and the smell of standing water where the earth was hiding something. "Water always tells the truth, Ruthie," he used to say, crouched beside some rich man's flooded pasture with his hat pushed back and his knife turning a stick over in his hands. "Ground can lie to you. Grass can lie. Water can't. It goes where it wants to go, and if you watch it long enough, it'll show you why." She had thought of that saying more than once in the weeks after Daniel died, when she sat in the mercantile's back room doing sums that never came out right, and she thought of it again standing in the auction yard the day they sold off the old Hargrove orchard, 12 acres of apple and pear trees running down into a low valley that flooded every spring and drowned half the roots before summer ever got started. Everyone in the county knew the Hargrove place was cursed with water. Old man Hargrove had sunk 2 fortunes into ditches and drains that never held, and when he died, his sons wanted nothing to do with it. And so it came up at auction on a gray morning with the fields already standing an inch deep from the spring thaw, the trees bare and black against a sky the color of dishwater. Jonas Pruitt bid first, out of habit more than interest, a token $5, just to see if anyone would match him. because everyone knew Pruitt already had the finest orchard in 3 counties, and no earthly use for a flooded one besides grazing land he wouldn't have to pay much for. When nobody answered his bid, he laughed, that big, easy laugh of his that carried over the whole yard, and said, "Well, somebody's got to take it off the county's hands. Might as well be me before the ducks claim squatters' rights." A few men laughed with him. Ruth did not laugh. She was doing the sums in her head again, the way her father had taught her, thinking about grade and fall and where a man like Hargrove might have gone wrong trying to drain low ground with a rich man's impatience instead of a poor man's care. $10, she said. The yard went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it isn't sure whether to be amused or embarrassed. Pruitt turned around slow, taking her in, the rolled sleeves and the coat that wasn't hers and the boots that had seen better winters. "Ruth Calloway," he said, like he was trying the name out to see if it fit what he was looking at. "You aimin' to farm ducks? Is that it?" "I'm aiming to bid," Ruth said. "Same as you." He bid 12. She bid 15, which was every dollar she had in the world besides what she owed on her room, and the auctioneer, a tired man named Whitfield, who'd clearly rather be anywhere else in that cold, looked between them and asked Pruitt if he cared to go higher. Pruitt looked at the flooded fields and at Ruth, and something in his face decided the joke had gone on long enough to be entertaining and not so long as to cost him anything real. "Let the widow have her ducks," he said, and the crowd laughed again, and that was how Ruth Calloway came to own 12 acres of drowned orchard for $15, a laugh that would follow her into town for weeks, and a debt of curiosity she didn't yet know how to name. She moved out to the place within the week, into the leaning cabin that had stood empty since the Hargrove boys left, its roof patched with tin that rattled in the wind, and its floor cold enough that she slept in Daniel's coat as well as under it. She brought the trunk of his tools and a few chickens a neighbor had given her out of pity more than generosity, and on her second week out there, against the advice of the one neighbor woman who still spoke to her kindly, she spent nearly the last of her money on 6 ducks from a farm 2 towns over, because she remembered her father saying once that ducks would tell you more about standing water than a week of watching it yourself, if you paid attention to where they wanted to swim. At first, the ducks did what ducks do, paddling the flooded rows without particular purpose, and Ruth spent her days doing what her father had taught her without complaint, walking the fields at dawn when the frost still held the mud firm enough to read, marking with chalk on stakes she'd whittled from fallen branches where the water stood deepest and where it seemed to move, however slowly, toward some low point she hadn't yet found. She carried her father's old knife everywhere, the one thing of his she'd kept besides his sayings, its handle worn smooth from a hand that wasn't hers, and she used it to cut new stakes and to scratch marks into the ones already planted, the same ritual over and over. Scrape the mud away, check the water line against yesterday's mark, note the number in the little book she kept in her apron pocket, wait for tomorrow. It was slow work, and it told her almost nothing for the first 2 weeks, besides confirming what everyone already knew, that the whole low third of the orchard held water like a bowl and wasn't draining the way spring floods ought to drain. But in the 3rd week, she noticed the ducks had stopped wandering, All 6 of them, the white one and the 5 brown ones, with their green-headed necks catching what little sun came through the clouds, had taken to circling one particular spot near the center of the low ground, a spot that looked no different from any other patch of flooded orchard to Ruth's eye, except that the water there seemed just faintly darker, and when she waded out to stand near it, she thought she could feel, through the soles of her boots, the faintest suggestion of a pool, like the ground itself was swallowing something it couldn't quite finish. She marked that spot with 2 stakes instead of 1, and she began to watch it the way her father had taught her to watch anything that didn't behave the way its neighbors did. Water always tells the truth. She just had to learn what this water was trying to say. Word travels fast in a small county, and word of Ruth Calloway wading around her flooded orchard talking to ducks and driving stakes into mud traveled faster than most. Jonas Pruitt rode out one afternoon under the excuse of checking on a boundary line, though everyone, including Ruth, understood he'd come to see for himself whether the widow's foolishness had a shape to it yet. He sat his horse at the edge of the flooded rows, dry boots and clean coat, and watched her for a while without getting down, and when she finally straightened up from her stakes and looked at him, he said, not unkindly, but not kindly either, "You know Hargrove tried draining this bowl for near on 10 years. Man knew more about orchards than you or I ever will, and it beat him." "I heard," Ruth said. "He dug 3 sets of ditches, brought a fellow up from the city with fancy notions about tile drains, spent money he didn't have." Pruitt shook his head, looking out over the water with something that might almost have been sympathy if it hadn't come wrapped in so much certainty. "Water in that bowl isn't rainwater, Mrs. Calloway. It's spring-fed from somewhere up under the ridge, and a man can't outdig a spring. You're wasting good boot leather." "Maybe," Ruth said, and didn't say anything else, because she'd learned by then that arguing with a man like Pruitt only fed him more reasons to be right, and she went back to her stakes, and after a while he clicked his tongue at his horse and rode off. And that night she wrote in her little book, in her plain schoolgirl hand, the words, "Spring-fed, not rain," and underlined them twice, because whatever else Pruitt was wrong about, she believed he was right about that, and it changed the whole shape of the problem in her mind. A spring wasn't a flood you drained away. A spring was a flow you had to give somewhere to go. Her father's voice came to her that night, clearer than it had in months. Ground can lie to you. Water can't. If the flooding wasn't rain pooling in a bowl, but a spring finding no channel, then somewhere under that soaked black earth there had to be, or had once been, a way for that water to travel, because springs like that didn't simply appear with no history. Somebody, sometime, in the years before Hargrove and his fancy tile drains, had likely dealt with this ground before, and dealt with it well enough that trees had once grown tall enough to bear the kind of fruit that built the reputation the Hargrove name still carried in the county, tarnished as it now was. She started digging the next morning, not blind trenches the way Hargrove's men had, but careful test holes along a line that ran from the duck's circling spot down toward the lowest fence line, spaced the way her father used to space his soundings, checking each one for stone, for old wood, for anything that wasn't simply mud. It was backbreaking, solitary work, and for the better part of 2 weeks, it gave her nothing but blistered palms and a back that ached every night worse than the last. Until, on a gray Tuesday, her spade struck something that rang different from stone, a dull, hollow, buried sound. And when she cleared the mud away with her hands, she found the top edge of what looked like old fieldstone, laid in a curve, deliberate, the kind of shape that didn't happen by accident in nature. She sat back on her heels in the cold mud and laughed out loud for the first time since Daniel's funeral, a startled, disbelieving laugh that scared a heron off the fence line, because she understood, looking at that curve of stone, that somebody long before Hargrove had built a culvert here, a channel meant to carry spring water away from the orchard rows and out toward the creek at the property's edge, and that somewhere over the years it had silted up or collapsed or simply been forgotten, and the spring that fed it had gone on feeding it anyway, with nowhere left to go but up, into the tree's roots, into the low bowl of ground, into the standing water her ducks had been circling all along like they knew exactly what lay beneath it. She should have been patient after that. She knew it later, knew it the way you know a thing only once it's already cost you. But in the flush of that discovery, she felt something she hadn't felt in the whole long gray stretch since Daniel died, which was hope with teeth in it, hope sharp enough to make her reckless. She spent the next week clearing the culvert by hand where she could reach it, hauling out silt and rotted leaves and one badly rusted length of chain nobody could explain. And where the stone gave way to open, uncovered channel, she widened it with her spade, working from dawn until the light failed, certain that if she could just open the whole length of it before the next hard rain, she could prove Pruitt wrong, and prove the county wrong, and prove, most of all, to herself, that her father's way of seeing the world hadn't died with him unused. The rain came sooner than she'd planned for, a 2-day soaker that turned the sky the color of a day-old bruise, and Ruth, exhausted and proud and unwilling to stop, worked through the first evening of it, trying to finish opening the last stretch of buried channel before the water rose too high to work in. She misjudged the bank. The soaked earth gave beneath her all at once, no warning in it, and she went down hard into the half-cleared trench with a wrench of pain through her ankle that took the breath clean out of her. And by the time she dragged herself, soaked and shaking, back up to the cabin, the rain had turned the whole low bowl of the orchard into a churning brown lake that swallowed every stake she'd planted and every foot of channel she'd cleared, undoing in one night what had taken her 3 weeks to open. Word of it reached town faster than her ankle healed. Somebody, maybe the same neighbor who'd warned her against the ducks in the first place, mentioned to somebody else that the widow Calloway had gone and hurt herself, digging in the mud like a madwoman, chasing some notion about an old culvert that half the county now agreed was more likely a story she'd told herself than a thing she'd actually found. And Pruitt, when he heard it at the Mercantile, didn't bother hiding his amusement. "Told her a spring can't be outdug," he said, loud enough that it came back to Ruth within the day, the way everything did in a town that small. "Now she's laid up with a bad foot and a flooded field to show for it. Some folks won't learn a lesson till it's beat into them proper." Ruth sat in the cabin with her ankle wrapped and propped, furious at Pruitt and angrier still at herself, because she knew, lying there listening to the rain drum on the tin roof, that she'd done exactly the thing her father had always warned against.
Don't dig faster than you understand, Ruthie. Ground doesn't care how much you want it to hurry. She had wanted to prove something so badly that she'd forgotten to be careful, and the flood had come and taken her proof away as easily as a hand wiping a slate clean. It was in that low week, ankle swollen and confidence drowned along with her channel, that Abel Monroe rode up to her cabin on a mule so old and patient it looked half asleep even standing still. Ruth had seen him around town before, an old man who kept mostly to himself since he'd stopped taking paying work some years back, known vaguely as a fellow who used to dig wells and lay stonework for the county before his hands got too stiff for steady labor. But she'd never spoken 2 words to him in her life, and she couldn't imagine what business he had riding all the way out to a flooded orchard everyone else in the county had already written off as a joke. He didn't get down off the mule right away. He sat looking out over the water with the particular stillness of a man who has looked at a great many pieces of ground in his life and formed opinions about most of them. And after a while he said, "Heard you found stone under there." "I did," Ruth said, wary, because she'd had enough of men riding out to look at her failure and feel confirmed in their doubts. "Heard you also near broke your ankle trying to clear the whole thing in a week." "I did that too." Monroe made a small sound that might have been a laugh if he'd let more air into it. "Your father was Samuel Calloway," he said, not quite a question. "Dug ditches for half this county back when I was still laying stone for the other half. Man knew water better than anybody I ever worked beside, and I worked beside plenty." He looked at her for the first time properly, taking in the wrapped ankle, the mud-stiffened dress, the stubborn set of her jaw that she couldn't quite soften even sitting still in pain. "You've got his eye for it, from what I hear. What you don't have yet is his patience, and that's going to keep costing you until you learn it." Ruth wanted to argue, out of pride more than conviction, but something about the old man's flat, unhurried certainty made arguing feel like a waste of both their time. "Then teach me," she said instead. He came back the next week when her ankle could bear weight again, and for the better part of a month he taught her things her father had never gotten the chance to, not out of any failing in her father, but simply because a man teaches a daughter what he has time for, and Samuel Calloway had run out of time before he'd run out of things to say. Monroe taught her how to read the fall of a channel with a length of cord and a stone weight instead of guessing by eye, how to lay stone so the water's own pressure sealed the joints tighter instead of working them loose, how to build a channel in sections so a single flood couldn't undo a season's work in one night the way hers had. He was not a warm man, not given to praise, but he was patient in a way that steadied her, and more than once, watching her work, he said something that might have come straight from her father's mouth until she began to wonder if all men who'd spent their lives serving water instead of owning land ended up speaking the same quiet language. "Culvert's old," he told her one afternoon, running his thumb along the mortarless joints of the stone she'd uncovered, joints fitted so precisely that even after decades of neglect, the water had only found the smallest gaps to escape through. "Older than Hargrove's people, I'd wager. This is the kind of work men did before anybody in this county thought to write things down proper. Somebody built this to last, and near did, until the leaves and silt choked it slow enough nobody noticed till the trees started dying." "Can we clear the rest of it before winter?" Ruth asked. "We can," Monroe said, "if we do it right this time
and not all at once like a woman trying to prove something to a man who doesn't deserve the satisfaction. She had the grace to laugh at that, and they set to work properly, clearing the channel in careful sections, shoring each length as they went, checking Monroe's cord and stone measurements against her own chalk marks, the way her father had taught her to check any figure twice before trusting it. The ducks, through all of it, kept their strange vigil, circling nearer the work as the water slowly began to draw down along the cleared stretches, as if they understood, in whatever way ducks understand anything, that the mystery they'd been guarding was finally being answered. The trouble that came next didn't come from the ground at all, but from the county courthouse, in the shape of a tired clerk named Osgood, who informed Ruth, when she rode in to ask about recording the old culvert as an improvement and securing whatever water rights might come with restoring it, that the county's own survey maps showed no drainage structure of any kind on the old Hargrove parcel, spring-fed or otherwise, and that without record of an existing right restoring flow through a channel that crossed near the boundary of Pruitt's land could just as easily be read as diverting water Pruitt might claim belonged to him by long-standing use, whether or not any such claim had merit. "The stone's sitting right there in the ground," Ruth said, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice, and only half succeeding. "I can take you out and show you myself." Osgood looked genuinely sorry, in the worn-down way of a man who has spent too many years watching lived truth lose arguments to paperwork. "I don't doubt you, Mrs. Calloway, but the county goes by what's recorded, and what's recorded says there's no structure there at all. If Mr. Pruitt wanted to make trouble over it, and men in his position sometimes do when water's involved, you'd have no paper to stand on, only stone in the ground, and your own word for how old it is." Ruth rode home from that conversation angrier than the flood, or the mockery, or even Pruitt's laughing bid had ever made her, because she understood, in a way she hadn't quite let herself understand before, that the county's blindness to what was buried under her own land was exactly the same blindness that had let her father dig other men's ditches his whole life, without ever once being written down as the reason those ditches worked. Paper remembered owners. It never remembered hands. She didn't wait for the county to catch up to the ground. With autumn closing in and the first hard frost only weeks off, she and Monroe worked from first light to last, finishing the channel clearance in the days before a storm that everyone in the valley could feel coming in the way the birds went quiet and the air went heavy and still. This time, there was no reckless rush in it, only steady, sectioned work, cord and stone, chalk mark and check, the same slow ritual repeated until the whole buried length of that old culvert ran clear from the circling spot where the ducks still gathered, clean down to the creek at the property line. The storm broke 2 nights later, harder than the one that had cost her the ankle, rain hammering the tin roof until she couldn't hear her own thoughts over it, and Ruth lay awake in the dark, counting the minutes, the way she'd once counted dollars, waiting to learn whether 3 months of watching and digging and failing and learning had built something that would hold, or something that would wash away again, same as before. Toward morning, the rain eased, and she pulled on her boots over her still tender ankle and walked out into the gray first light to see for herself. The bowl of the orchard, which should have stood a foot deep in standing water after a storm like that, held only shallow puddles between the tree rows, the ground beneath them dark and soaked but not drowned. And down at the low fence line, where the old culvert emptied into the creek, water ran steady and clear and strong, carrying off in an hour what would once have taken the tree's roots all season to slowly rot in. The ducks had left their circling spot at last, scattered out across the drained rows, paddling the shallow puddles with the unbothered ease of birds who had simply been waiting all along for the ground to finally do what it was supposed to do. Ruth stood at the edge of her trees and wept, not from sadness, but from the particular exhaustion of having been right about something the whole world had told her she was foolish to believe. Recovery after that came the way her father had always told her real recovery comes, slow and unglamorous and mostly invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. The trees that had survived years of drowned roots didn't spring back to health overnight. Some of the oldest, weakest ones never did recover, and Ruth and Monroe cleared them out through the winter to make room for grafts taken from the healthier stock, small pale slips of wood bound onto sturdier roots, and watched, almost daily, the way Ruth had once watched her stakes, for the first tentative sign of a bud taking hold. She kept account of them in the same little book where she'd once recorded water levels, a running tally of grafts that failed and grafts that held. And by the time the first green showed at the tip of the earliest one, small and stubborn against the gray bark, she had long since stopped thinking of the orchard as a joke $15 had bought her, and started thinking of it, quietly, as the first thing in her life that was fully, unmistakably hers. By spring, the difference was plain enough, that even people who'd laughed at the auction rode out, under one excuse or another, to see the flooded Hargrove bowl running dry and green instead of drowned. The county sent a surveyor at last, prompted less by Ruth's word than by the plain evidence of drained, thriving ground that no amount of missing paperwork could argue away. And the old culvert was recorded, finally, with Ruth Calloway's name attached to its restoration. The first time in the county's records that a Calloway had ever been written down as anything other than a hired hand. Osgood himself, to his credit, seemed almost pleased to do the recording, as if some part of him had wanted the ground to win the argument all along. Jonas Pruitt came out in early summer, dressed for business instead of mockery, and stood at the edge of the same rows he'd once called a widow's foolish waste, looking at trees heavy with young fruit and ground firm enough to walk across without sinking to the ankle. He didn't apologize, not directly, because men like Pruitt rarely do. But he came close enough for the county to talk about it for weeks after. "Didn't think you'd manage it," he said, turning his hat in his hands the way a nervous man does when he's about to ask for something he isn't sure he deserves. "I'll give you a fair price for the place, Mrs. Calloway. Fairer than $15, I promise you that. Might save you the trouble of running an orchard on your own." Ruth looked past him at the rows of trees she and Monroe had brought back from drowned ruin, at the ducks still paddling the drainage pond they'd left at the low end of the culvert's run, because it seemed a shame to drain away entirely a thing that had shown her so much. And she thought of her father's voice, and of every ditch he'd dug for men who never once offered to sell him so much as an inch of what his hands had made possible. "I don't believe I'm selling," she said, "but I thank you for asking." Pruitt didn't argue.
He nodded, the way a man does when he already half expected the answer and respects it more than he'd like to admit, and rode off. And Ruth stood alone at the edge of her orchard, listening to the water still running quiet and steady through the old stone channel her ducks had found for her, remembering the day she'd knelt in the cold mud, watching 6 birds circle a hole in the floodwater like they were guarding a secret. They had been. The secret was never treasure, not in the way the whole county had first imagined when word got out that the widow's ducks had led her to something buried. No coin or gold or forgotten strongbox waiting under the mud. What lay underground was older and plainer than that. 100 years of somebody's careful, unrecorded labor, waiting quietly for someone patient enough to listen to the water and find it. And Ruth understood, standing there with her father's knife still worn smooth in her apron pocket, that some ground doesn't need to hide riches to be worth every bit of what it costs to save. It only needs somebody willing to watch it long enough to hear what it's been trying to say all along.